Today we will talk about a horrific crime that scarred the residents of Australia. The small town of Prospect, New South Wales may never heal from this crime. Former Miss Australia winner and nurse Anita Cobby was abducted, raped, and decapitated Sunday morning, February 2, 1986. Anita got a call while she was getting ready for work from her husband asking if he should pick her up after work. She was working as a nurse in the surgical ward at Sydney Hospital until 3 p.m. that day, but she refused and said she had made plans with her friends and planned on sleeping at her parents' home. Little did they know, that would have been the last time they ever spoke to each other. Anita and her two friends, Annette, Lynn, Bradshaw and Elaine Bray, went to Redfern Restaurant that evening and had an amazing time. Around 8:30 p.m. that evening, Elaine, who lived in Crow's Nest, offered Anita to stay at her place that night, but Anita said no, because she wanted to sleep in since her shift started at 1:30 p.m. the next day. Lynn then drove Anita to the Central Railway Station and boarded the train to Blacktown. By the time Anita had arrived at Blacktown Railway Station, it was late. Usually, she would call her father to pick her up, but unfortunately, the payphones were vandalized and there was no available taxi. Anita's home was around 2 kilometers away, which would be around a 30 minutes walk. Anita didn't think much of it and decided to walk home through the town she was so familiar with. Now, before we get into what happened that night, let's talk about Anita Cobby. According to her friends, she was gorgeous, kind, and full of life. She regularly participated in beauty pageants, and she had won the Miss Western Suburbs beauty pageant in 1979. After graduating high school, Anita followed her mother's footsteps and decided to enroll in nursing school. During her training, she met John, who also was a fellow nurse. They fell in love and decided to get married. According to John, when he saw Anita, it was love at first sight. He was dating another girl during the time he met Anita, and apparently, he had strong feelings for her, but he couldn't help the strong attraction he had for Anita. One day Anita passed by John in the hallway and struck up a conversation with him. They clicked right away and became inseparable. He was single now and asked Anita out on a date. For their first date, they went to a restaurant and talked for hours. They loved the food there and the atmosphere of the restaurant so much that they went there often. Anita and John became friends with the staff and owner. Everyone there knew how much they loved each other and how happy they were. 6 months after they started dating, they moved in together, and a year after they started dating they were engaged. Some people may consider this moving fast, but Anita and John knew they couldn't live without each other. Soon after their happiness doubled, they found out they were pregnant. Sadly, however, they had a miscarriage, but this devastating moment didn't waver their love for each other. Anita and John had a small Catholic wedding and only invited their close family and friends. Instead of having a honeymoon, they decided to put the money they saved towards renting a house. Eventually got 2 dogs and bought a boat. Anita and John loved their life. They loved being free and being outdoors. Both worked hard during the week, and on the weekend, they would grab both dogs and sail on their boat. Few years later, Anita and John moved to Coffs Harbour. Anita got a job as a nurse at the local hospital, and John trained horses by day, and at night he was a nurse. A year later, one of John's friends flew down to Coffs Harbour and went to the races, where John placed a bet on one of his own horses. In the end, John ended up winning $10,000, and with that money, he and Anita traveled and enjoyed life. Once they came back home, John realized that he had had enough of traveling, having fun with just his friends and wife. He wanted more. He wanted to start a family and have children. Anita, however, wanted to continue traveling, hang out with friends and do things as a couple. This led to many arguments and caused them to drift apart since they wanted very different things during that stage of their life. In the end, they decided to take a break from their marriage. Anita cancelled their lease and moved in with her parents, and John moved in with his mom and sister. Who would have guessed that 6 weeks after Anita moved in with her parents and walked along the familiar road home, it would lead to the worst night of Anita's life and eventually her death? Now let's head back to the night of Anita's murder. What we know so far is that Anita decided to walk home the 2 kilometers and she never made it home. The next morning, her parents realized she wasn't home but didn't worry too much since she was a grown adult. They knew she was out with friends and figured she probably slept over at a friend's home. Things got worrisome when her parents received a call from her work asking where Anita was. Her colleagues, boss, and family knew Anita as a responsible, punctual adult who was never late for work. And if on the off chance she was, she would call in and let them know. Right away the parents went to the police station to file a missing report. Once they were home they called everyone Anita knew to see if they had heard or seen her. Later that evening, the parents decided to call John Cobby, and immediately he went to Anita's parents' home. He also tried calling people and asking around. The next day the police received a disturbing call from a local farmer. The police went to Reen Farm and saw a horrifying scene. The farmer told the police that morning he saw the cows out in the pasture huddled together but didn't think much of it and went on with his day, but when he saw the same thing hours later, he knew something was wrong and decided to go see what was wrong. As he got closer to the cows, he saw a bloody naked body face down. When he looked at the body, he immediately knew that this woman was tortured beyond belief. The police then asked him routine questions. The farmer did mention he heard a scream late at night that woke him up. But he didn't think much of it since he did have a history of teenagers coming into his fields, screaming and having fun late at night. Never did he think it was screams of a woman being raped and murdered. The police tried to look for an ID but couldn't find anything. They did however notice a unique Russian interlocking ring on her finger. So they hoped to identify the body with that. The police then turned the body over and saw her eyes were wide open and there was horror and pain on her face. After the police were done with the crime scene, they went back to the station and started looking through the missing persons reports and came across Anita Cobby's report. They saw the picture Anita's father, Gary, brought in and compared it to the women's body they had found. They were 99% sure it was her, but they wanted to make sure. So they called up Anita's parents and asked him to come to the station. They brought the ring to them, and the parents did confirm right away that, yes, it was Anita's ring. The police then turned to John and asked him to come and identify the body. But he said he couldn't do it and how he wasn't able to see her in that state. Grace, Anita's mother, then said she would go in and confirm the body since as a nurse she has seen dead bodies before. The police said no because they knew the state Anita was in, and as a woman and mother, they couldn't let her see her. It would have been devastating not just as a woman but as a mother seeing your child like that. Gary then decided to go to the morgue and confirm the body. He took one look at the body and said, "I wish I could say that's not my daughter, but then it would be someone else's daughter and they would be going through what I am going through." He knew she went through something worse than hell. and he completely broke. The police decided to put together a team that would look after this case. First, they investigated the people closest to Anita. They brought in John Cobby for questioning. They believed he was behind it, since he and Anita had separated 6 weeks prior. And they got an anonymous tip from an alleged close family member saying how they should investigate the husband since he was obsessed with her. Shortly after, another tip came in accusing John of saying things about Anita. The police asked him many questions about their marriage. What happened? Why did they separate? How were things before, and then eventually asked for his alibi for Sunday night. John told him that he was alone at home. He came home from work and stayed there, and the next morning he went back to work. Officers and detectives did not believe him. They still were suspicious of him because in most murder cases the spouse or partner is the culprit of murder. And his alibi wasn't sold. There was no way to confirm if he was at home alone. The police believed his motive was that he wasn't over Anita and that it was his jealousy that made him torture and murder Anita. At this point the police kept pushing and accusing John of killing Anita, asking why he would do such a thing, that he should admit to it. They even got physical with him. According to John, they slammed him to the ground, pushed him to the wall, and even slammed his face to the wall and repeatedly said, "You did this, just admit it," to try and force a confession. Little did they know that John and Anita had started seeing each other and were already looking at houses to rent to move in together. John was in love with Anita. He was head over heels for her, and he felt so guilty and blamed himself for her death. Why? That morning when he called her asking if he should pick her up after work, did he not push some more? Why didn't he offer to pick her up after the dinner date with her friends? If he had, none of this would have happened and Anita would still be here. Because of this guilt, the fogginess of his brain, hours of questioning, the physical abuse and the constant blame of him doing it and how he should admit to it, John admitted to the murder. The investigators then realized something. Even though they got a confession out of John, they weren't satisfied. Things didn't add up. And in the back of their minds, they knew that this confession was forced. So they went back to the autopsy report. The investigators realized the wounds Anita had suffered were very different from each other. It was clear that multiple people were a part of this. Not just one. The wounds, the weapons, the extent to which she was brutalized could not have been possible by one person in a short amount of time. Eventually, they ruled out John. And sadly there was no one else on the suspect list, so they continued to search and dig. They couldn't figure out who was behind it or what the motive was. They had no leads at all. They started looking at local sex offenders living near the train station and the route home. People who had a history of crimes against women. But they were ruled out. The media found out about this case and did everything to push it to every outlet. The police encouraged it, hoping it would lead to some leads. Soon, a very well-known morning radio DJ, John Laws, got a hold of Anita's autopsy report. He contemplated for hours if he should read it on air, but then decided the public has a right to know. Before this, the public nor Anita's parents knew of what Anita went through, but now all of Australia did. Once the public heard the autopsy report, they were outraged. Anita's parents were also upset, but in the end, were thankful because they believed the public needed to know. The leaked autopsy report spread like fire nationally. On the autopsy report, the medical examiner mentioned Anita's body showed extensive bruising on her head, breasts, face, shoulders, groin, thighs and legs which were consistent with a systematic beating. Her breasts were so damaged it seemed like someone had targeted them on purpose. She had lacerations on her hips, thighs and legs from the barbed wire. Several cuts to her neck. Her ear was nearly severed. Her windpipe was severed. On one hand, most of her fingers were fractured. On the other hand, her 3 fingers were nearly severed off, making it seem like she was trying to protect her face or throat from the knife. She had defensive wounds all along her arms and wrists. Her entire body was bloody and beaten. Her eye socket was broken and both eyes were completely black, and both of her cheekbones were broken and both shoulders were dislocated. When her body was found, her eyes were open, indicating she had seen the killer slice her throat. The medical examiner, in court, said the reports made by the radio station were altered and Anita was not mutilated apart from slashing of her throat and hands. And there was no attack with a knife on her stomach or genitals, and her shoulders were not dislocated. After hearing all this on the morning radio show, everyone was struck with fear and hatred. People wanted justice, but more than that, they wanted blood. They wanted the killers to be given capital punishment. Everyone was talking about it. They started raising money, had protests, tried getting interviews with the police. The people of Australia were livid. The Premier at the time offered a $50,000 reward for anyone who had information leading to the arrest of Anita's killer. Days later, the reward doubled. The pressure on the detectives grew immensely, which resulted in the decision to reenact Anita's last night in hopes it would jog the minds of those who passed by her. They got an officer to dress up like Anita and start the night like how Anita did. Through this, they realized that Anita took the earlier train, not the one they had initially thought of. This led to them discovering that around the time Anita would have been on Newtown Road. This caused the police to realize they got several calls from various people in that area that night. The first call they received was from a 13-year-old boy and his 14-year-old sister, and they said they heard a woman screaming, and when they went outside, they saw a woman getting grabbed and pushed into a car. They tried running to the car, but the car drove off. At that moment their older brother had come home, and they told the brother what they saw. He got back into the car and started searching for the woman and the car. Paul, the brother, went up to Reen Road and did see a car that fit the description his brother gave, but when he went up to it with his flashlight, nothing seemed suspicious. He didn't find anything inside of it. Nothing seemed suspicious. So, he thought it wasn't the same car and left. The police followed up and now had a description of the car. A few days after, the detective on this case got a tip that would lead to this case finally being solved and arresting Anita's killer. A police informant told the police they had seen 3 men steal a car that fit the description of the car that had taken Anita that night. The man who was said to have stolen the car was John Travers. It was known to the people of Blacktown that 22-year-old John Travers ran in a group and he was the leader of that group. The other 2 men were Michael Murdoch, who was 18, and Leslie Murphy, who was 22. Leslie Murphy was also dating Travers' sister. When the police heard that they stole the car and could potentially be behind Anita's murder, they sent up 2 teams to go pick up the men once they located them. One team went to Travers' family home, and the second group went to Travers' uncle's home. Both teams forced entry and found Travers and Murdoch sleeping in the same bed at the uncle's home, and found Leslie at Travers' family home. When all 3 men were brought in for questioning, Leslie and Michael both admitted to stealing the car and were released on bail. However, they were both put under surveillance. They had undercover cops watching their every move. Travers also admitted to stealing the car. But he made some shocking comments about Anita. So back when the team raided Travers' uncle's home, they found a bloody knife, and when the police questioned Travers about it, he said, "I didn't slit that slut's throat." The police were a little taken aback since they didn't even mention Anita. Before we get into what happened next, let's talk about these boys. John Travers had a very hard childhood. He grew up in poverty, and allegedly his father would physically and sexually abuse him. Because of this, he turned to drugs and alcohol around the age of 12 and 13. By 14 he was dependent on these substances, which eventually got him kicked out of school. With this newfound free time, he would be on the street robbing people and stores so he could pay for the substances. His mother had had enough and sent him away in hopes he would reform, but that didn't happen. When he returned from the reform program, his mother became very ill and couldn't care for him or his siblings anymore. This caused the kids to be separated and be put into different foster homes. With this change, he started becoming sexually violent. Not just with people but with animals as well. John told a story of how he once stole a sheep and was planning on just killing it and barbecuing it, but before he did that, he sodomized it and slit its throat at the same time. Seeing the sheep in that state gave him gratification and pleasure, which later was confirmed that there was his semen on the sheep's wound. Michael Murdoch was John's best friend. He was considered to be John's sidekick. Found him super cool and wanted to be just like him. He also grew up in poverty like John, but there are no reports of physical, mental, or sexual abuse from his family. However, as soon as he met John, they had a very similar lifestyle. Michael did everything exactly like John. Robbing stores, doing drugs, getting kicked out of school. It's like Michael was another John. The third name given was Leslie Murphy. He had a history of robbery and petty crime. The other two were Leslie's older brothers, Gary and Michael Murphy. Besides John, the group didn't have any history of violent crime or crime against women. Like previously mentioned, John Travers did have a history of rape allegations. So they took blood samples from him and kept him in the station. While in the holding cell, Travers asked if he could call his aunt to bring him cigarettes. The police asked for the aunt's number and called her. When the aunt, who is actually the girlfriend of the uncle whose house Travers and Michael were found in, picked up the call, she immediately told the police that she needed to speak to them about John Travers. How she wanted to speak to them for the last couple of days but didn't know how to. The aunt and the detectives decided to meet that night. Around 6 p.m. that evening, two detectives met with the aunt and said she immediately looked uncomfortable. So they decided to take her to their unmarked police car to make her feel comfortable. Once she got into the car, the aunt opened up. She said she had a bad feeling for the last few weeks that Travers was involved in Anita's murder. Travers had a history of telling the aunt about all the crimes he committed in the past whenever he would commit any type of crime or sexual assault. He would tell the aunt, but he didn't tell her about Anita's murder. The aunt just had a bad feeling that he was involved. The police then decided to come up with a plan. They told the aunt to come to the station and bring him the cigarettes as he requested. And while she is with Travers, she would have a hidden tape recorder on her. The officers wanted the aunt to gradually bring up the topic of Anita without raising suspicion. To get a confession. A few days later, the aunt came to the police station and brought cigarettes and had a normal conversation with Travers. As she predicted, he opened up about Anita right away. She asked if he had sex with Anita. She made sure she didn't use the word rape because she wanted him to feel comfortable and open up, and didn't want it to seem like she was fishing. He did say he did have sex with Anita and continued to say 4 other men were involved. He told her the entire story of what happened that night and just laughed through it all like he was showing off and had absolutely no remorse. He then asked the aunt for help, asking her to go back to his parents' house to find his favorite knife with the brown wooden handle which he used to kill Anita, and then also find his jeans which were bloody from that night, to get rid of it, and lastly go to Leslie Murphy's home and get rid of the car. Additionally, John came up with a plan to get out of the holding cell. Right next to the police station was a train station, so he told his aunt to go up to the train station and derail one of the trains so the train can go off the tracks and hit the back of the police station, and then with the hole in the station and no one really paying attention to him, he will escape. He then came up with a new plan. He asked his aunt to go speak with Michael Murdoch and Leslie Murphy and get him to come to the station with guns drawn between 33 to 30 am because that's when there's the least number of officers at the station. People wondered why all of a sudden the aunt decided to shed a light to Travers' deeds when before he already had a history of rape and she knew about things he had done but never went to the police. She said that it was because no woman should ever go through what Anita went through. When the aunt returned to the offices with the confession recorded, she collapsed and kept saying he did it. The police now had a full confession. They knew that all 5 people were responsible, but they wanted to make sure, so they decided to get a second confession from another member of the group. The aunt went over to Michael Murdoch's home with the recording device. She started off saying how Travers admitted everything, how she knows everything, and then asked what happened. First, Michael didn't admit to anything, but he did leak tidbits of similar things that Travers did, so in the end the police did have a confirmation of the confession which would hold up in court. Once the police reviewed the information, they immediately went to arrest them. After the police went to Travers' parents' home to search for the clothes. 2 days later, they found the last 2 men. When Gary Murphy saw the police, he ran out of the back door into the garden to escape, but of course the police had the house surrounded and tackled him, and when the handcuffs came on his hand, he peed himself. He was that scared of the police. So in 22 days all 5 men were arrested and charged. They then took the men to re-NCT what happened that night and made them explain step by step what they did that night and where they went. Now, what happened the night of Anita's murder? We know she took the 8:48 p.m. train from Central Railway Station to Blacktown Station, and when she got to Blacktown Station she was going to call her dad, but all the payphones there had been vandalized, and there were no taxis at the stand, so she decided to walk the 2 kilometers home. At that time, 5 men were driving down the street. They were drunk, high from drugs and looking for a good time. Travers first saw Anita and said to slow down the car next to her. And then he and Michael jumped out of the car and grabbed Anita and pushed her into the back seat, while beating her so she would stop screaming and fighting. Once she was inside the car, they forced her to take her clothes off. Anita was kicking and screaming, and they kept punching her face. She kept saying she's on her period and that she is married, but they didn't care. They just beat her more. They did stop at a gas station to put gas in the car they stole. Before entering the gas station and while putting the gas in, they pushed Anita all the way down towards the feet of the back and held a knife to her throat so she wouldn't scream. Once they put a bit of gas, They took money from Anita's wallet to pay. The men then drove her to Reen Road, and when they got to a field they told her to go to the field. But she was so physically broken from the beatings she couldn't move at all. So the men dragged her through a barbed wire fence to the field and continued sexually and physically assaulting her for an hour and a half. Until this point, the men all agreed with what happened that night. But now they started arguing. Argued with who exactly wanted Anita dead. Majority did say in the end it was a unanimous decision that they should kill her since she knew what they looked like. Then encouraged Travers to kill her. Travers then took his knife and slit her throat. It was said that he did it so forcibly that it almost severed her throat. It is believed that from the time her throat was slit to the time she died it was 2 minutes. The men then took her clothes and their clothes besides John Travers, who wanted to keep his bloodied clothes, and burned it. When trial began for these men, it was insane. There was so many people outside waiting to see the men. When the men were transferred into the cars, the people surrounded them. The police had to drive super slowly. People were campaigning for the death penalty, but at that time, the death penalty was abolished from New South Wales. People came all the time in front of the courts to show their support and try to push for capital punishment. They made signs saying it and even made a dummy that was hanging from a rope around his neck to make it crystal clear what they wanted. The parents didn't hold any anger towards the killers. They didn't forgive them, but they believed being angry towards the killers and having those negative thoughts were only going to harm themselves. So they took that and started raising awareness for women to make better decisions and be safer. The parents wanted to remember and honor Anita's life and not associate it with any type of hate. With Anita, she couldn't do anything else. Her only option was to walk. The pay phones were out and there were no taxis. Gary and Grace made it a point that if the option is there, get a ride. Use the phone. Don't think, oh, my home is right there, I'll just walk. John Cobby fell into drug and alcohol abuse after Anita's death. He believed that in a way he wanted to die by accidentally overdosing and didn't have the courage to kill himself. Later on he did get help. He went in and out of psych hospitals and was left with severe mental health issues. Years later, he did start dating again, got married, and had kids, but not before changing his name. Mentally it got to a point where he couldn't think or say the name Cobby without thinking of Anita. So, he changed his name to John Francis. 2 decades later, John realized he was just running from his past and he needed to embrace it, so with the help of his son, he changed his last name to Cobby. Even his son did too. To support him. Back to the aunt. John Travers was well connected to dangerous men, and these men did find out it was the aunt that told the police about what happened. The aunt started receiving death threats from the men, and her boyfriend, who was the uncle of Travers, and their children had to be put into witness protection. After 3 decades, in 2019, Gary Murphy was seen being transferred from Sydney's Prince of Wales Hospital to Long Bay Jail. After he spent several weeks at the hospital recovering from injuries sustained when he was attacked by several men in a shower block. Michael Murphy died in jail from liver cancer in February 2019 at the age of 66. Everyone else is still in jail. Well, that is it for today's case. Thank you for reading, and until the next case. Bye.